Are you sick of paying for Windows just so you can remove that annoying watermark and set your own wallpaper? Or maybe you just don't want Microsoft tracking you, or you resent them for constantly trying to force you to use Bing? Linux Mint might just be the operating system for you.
87 million people just left Windows for one single Linux system. And it didn't happen slowly. It exploded in just a few months. This isn't because Linux suddenly became better. It's because Microsoft made a decision that pushed millions of users away all at once. In this video, you're going to see exactly what's happening, why Linux Mint is growing faster than almost anything in tech right now, and the simple reason behind it that most people are completely missing. And once you see it, you won't look at operating systems the same way again. Linux Mint is supposed to be simple. It's not the most powerful. It's not the most advanced. It's just easy. So how does something like that grow 22 times in 6 months? Let's look at the numbers. A few months ago, it had around 380,000 downloads, then 1 million, then 3 million, then 8 million, and now over 18 million downloads in a single month. That's over 600,000 people installing it every single day. But here's where things get weird. Those numbers are actually smaller than the real story, because one download doesn't mean one user. And once you understand that, the scale becomes much bigger. Now here's where everything changes. When you hear downloads, you probably think one person equals one install. But this isn't an app. It's an operating system. And that changes the math completely. A small business downloads it once and installs it on 10 computers. A school does the same. Even at home, one download can mean multiple devices, so the download number is just the surface. What really matters is what happens after, and Linux Mint estimates that every download becomes around 2 installations, which means those millions of downloads turn into tens of millions of users. So instead of 40 million, you're looking at something closer to 80 or even 90 million people. And now, this isn't just growth. This is migration. Large groups of people moving at the same time. But here's the important part. People don't switch operating systems for no reason. It takes effort. It takes risk. So if millions are doing it, something is pushing them. And not just one thing, a combination of reasons happening all at once. Which leads to a much more interesting question. Why this one? Out of all the options, why did everyone land on Linux Mint? Because that answer explains everything that comes next. The answer is almost too simple. Linux Mint looks like Windows 7. That's it. And it might sound small, but this changes everything. Because most people don't want to learn something new. They just want something that feels familiar. So when they open Linux Mint for the first time, they don't feel lost. They don't feel confused. It feels like something they've already used for years. And that removes the biggest barrier that Linux always had. But here's where it gets interesting. It's not just that it looks similar. It's how accurately it copies what people already understand. And once you see how deep that goes, you start to realize why millions of people didn't just try it. They stayed. Start button, bottom left. Taskbar, right where you expect it. Your files, on the left side. Everything is exactly where your brain thinks it should be. You don't stop to think. You just use it. And that's the key. Because most people don't realize this. They're not learning a system. They're following habits they built over years. So when those habits still work, there's zero friction, no confusion, no frustration. It just feels natural. And that solves the biggest problem Linux always had. People trying it and quitting because it felt too different. But here's where it goes deeper. It's not just about where things are. It's about how everything behaves. And that detail is what makes people stick instead of going back. Most people don't want something new. They think they do, but they don't. What they really want is something that works without effort. Something predictable, something that doesn't force them to relearn everything. And this is where most tech companies get it wrong. They keep changing things. New layouts, new features, new systems, but every change creates friction. Every change forces people to adapt again, and over time, that becomes exhausting. So when users open Linux Mint and everything feels familiar, it's not just convenient. It's a relief, it feels stable, it feels safe, and that feeling is powerful because once people find something that just works, they don't want to leave it. But even that isn't enough to trigger millions of people to switch. Something had to push them to make the move. And that push is where this story really takes off. For years, people tolerated Windows. Even when things got worse, they stayed. Because switching felt too complicated, too risky, too unfamiliar. But then something changed. Windows 11 introduced strict hardware requirements, and suddenly, millions of perfectly working computers were no longer supported. People started seeing the same message. Your PC can't run Windows 11. Upgrade your hardware or stay behind. And for a lot of users, that didn't make sense. Their computers worked fine. They could browse, work, watch videos, no problem. But now they were being told it wasn't enough. So they had two options: spend money on a new computer or find another solution. And that's when many of them discovered Linux Mint. Not because they were looking for Linux, but because they were forced to look for anything else. At first, it wasn't an exciting decision. It was a backup plan, a temporary fix, something to get by. But that's what makes this moment so important. Because once they installed it, what they expected and what they experienced were completely different. And that gap is what turned curiosity into a massive shift. Most people didn't switch expecting something amazing. They expected a compromise, something good enough until they could go back to Windows. But that's not what happened. They installed Linux Mint, and their computers felt faster, cleaner, more responsive, no random slowdowns, no forced updates interrupting them. Things just worked. And that alone was surprising. But what really made the difference was how comfortable everything felt. People weren't struggling to find things. They weren't relearning basic actions. They were just using their computer like they always had. And for many, that feeling was unexpected. A business owner described it as getting Windows 7 back. An IT admin switched hundreds of computers, and support issues dropped massively. Older users who felt lost with newer systems suddenly felt in control again. And that's when something important started happening. People stopped thinking of it as a temporary fix and started seeing it as a better option. Not because it had more features, but because it removed friction. And when something makes your daily life easier, you don't go back. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because once people had that experience, they didn't keep it to themselves. They started sharing it, and that's what turned individual switches into something much bigger. Most people assume switching operating systems is complicated. You imagine commands, errors, things breaking. That's what kept people away from Linux for years. It felt risky, like one wrong step, and everything stops working. But Linux Mint removed most of that fear. The process is simple. You install it, and it guides you step by step. Clear options, simple choices, no confusing setup. Your files get moved, your system gets configured. Basic apps are already installed. In about an hour, you go from Windows to a fully working computer, and you don't need to be technical to do it. That's the real shift. Because before, switching required knowledge. Now, it just requires a decision, and that opens the door to a completely different type of user. Not just developers, not just tech people, regular users, students, teachers, small business owners, people who just want their computer to work without problems. And when they see that the process is this simple, the barrier disappears. Trying it no longer feels like a big risk. It feels manageable, even reversible. And that changes behavior. More people are willing to test it, more people give it a chance, and once they do, They experience the same thing: fast performance, simple interface, familiar layout. So now you have a pattern forming. People try it, they like it, they stay, then they tell someone else. And that someone else repeats the same process. This is where growth starts to accelerate, because it's no longer driven by curiosity alone. It's driven by confidence. People are not just trying it, they're recommending it. And when recommendations start stacking, growth stops being linear. It starts compounding. But there's one more layer on top of this. Something even more powerful than ease of use. Something that turns thousands of individual decisions into a massive wave of people moving in the same direction. At the beginning, this was just people switching operating systems. One person here, another one there. But that's not what it is anymore. Now, it's a movement. Because something interesting started to happen. People who switched didn't keep it to themselves. They started sharing it. They told friends. They helped coworkers. They showed family members how to install it. And suddenly, this wasn't just about software. It became social. Entire communities started forming around one idea: helping others leave Windows. There are millions of people in forums, groups, and comment sections, all doing the same thing: answering questions, sharing tutorials, helping complete strangers make the switch. And this changes everything. Because now, new users are not alone. They don't feel lost. They don't feel like they're doing something risky. They feel supported. And that removes one of the biggest fears people have when trying something new. But it goes even further than that. Because when people see others like them making the switch, it creates trust. It feels safe. It feels normal. Not like a technical decision, but like something everyone is starting to do. And that's how movements grow. Not through advertising, not through big campaigns, but through people. One person helps another. That person helps two more. And suddenly, the growth feeds itself. This is no longer just about how good Linux Mint is. It's about how many people are talking about it, recommending it, supporting it. And that creates momentum. The kind of momentum that's very hard to stop. But while all of this is happening on one side, there's something very different happening on the other. And that contrast is what makes this story even bigger. While all of this is happening, millions of people switching, communities growing, momentum building, Microsoft is moving in a completely different direction. They're focused on new features, AI integrations, a more modern experience, constant updates, constant changes, and on paper, that sounds like progress. But for many users, it feels like the opposite, because every update changes something. Menus move, settings get redesigned, things that used to be simple become harder to find. And over time, that creates frustration, not because the system is bad, but because it never stays the same. So while users are looking for stability, Microsoft is pushing change. While users want familiarity, Microsoft is pushing innovation. And that creates a gap, a growing disconnect between what users want and what the product is becoming. And instead of closing that gap, Microsoft keeps moving further in the same direction, adding more layers, more features, more complexity. But here's the key problem. Most people don't use their computer for advanced features. They use it for simple things: work, browsing, watching videos, organizing files. And for those tasks, more complexity doesn't help. It slows things down. It gets in the way. So now you have two completely different approaches. One system adding more and more, the other removing friction and keeping things simple. And when users are forced to choose, the decision becomes easier than expected. But this leads to a bigger realization, because this isn't just about Microsoft making a mistake. It's about understanding what people actually want. And that insight is what explains why this shift is happening at this scale. So let's go back to the main question. Why is this happening? It's not because Linux Mint is revolutionary. It's because it's familiar. It didn't try to reinvent everything. It gave people something they already understood. And in a world where everything keeps changing, that's exactly what many people want. This isn't really about Linux versus Windows. It looks like it, but it's not. What's happening here is much bigger. It's about how people interact with technology, because for years, the assumption has been the same. People want more. More features, more power, more innovation. But this situation shows something very different. Most people don't want more. They want better. And better doesn't mean more complex. It means easier, faster, more predictable. Something that works the same way every single day, and that's where the shift happens. Linux Mint didn't win by adding something revolutionary. It didn't introduce some crazy new feature. It simply removed friction. It made things simple again, familiar again, and that turned out to be more valuable than innovation. Because when people sit in front of a computer, they're not thinking about technology. They're thinking about what they need to do. Finish work, send a file, watch something, solve a problem. And the less the system gets in the way, the better the experience feels. That's the insight most companies miss. They build for what's possible, not for what's comfortable. And over time, that creates distance between the product and the user. But here, that gap was closed. Not by moving forward, but by going back to what already worked. And that's why millions of people didn't just try Linux Mint, they chose it. Because in the end, the best technology doesn't feel advanced. It feels invisible. It just works. And that simple idea is what's driving one of the biggest shifts in personal computing right now. So where does this go from here? Because this isn't slowing down. Every month, more people switch. More computers get replaced, more users realize they don't actually need what they thought they needed. And that creates momentum, the kind that builds quietly and then suddenly feels unstoppable. If this continues at the current pace, Linux Mint could reach over 150 million users very soon. That would put it ahead of entire operating systems that have been around for decades. But the numbers are only part of the story. What really matters is what this shift represents. Because once people realize they have an alternative, they start questioning everything. Do I really need to upgrade my computer? Do I really need to pay for this? Do I really need to adapt to constant changes? And once those questions start, they don't stop. That's how bigger shifts begin. Not all at once, but gradually. One decision at a time. And this is where it gets interesting, because Linux Mint is just one example. There are other systems, other approaches, trying to solve the same problem in completely different ways. Some are focusing on simplicity, others are going even further, rethinking how we use computers entirely. And one of them is growing in a way that could be even more disruptive than this, not by copying the past, but by changing what the future looks like. And once you see how that works, you'll understand why this shift is only getting started.